Buenas tardes a todos. Muchísimas gracias por continuar con nosotros en este Polaris Control Summit 2021. Mi nombre es Juan Pablo García, gerente técnico de Polaris Controls, y realmente estamos muy contentos, muy orgullosos de presentarles una nueva marca en el portafolio de Polaris Controls, que es Trinnov Audio. Realmente una marca líder en el segmento de aplicaciones de teatro en casa, estudios de grabación, Hi-Fi, 2-Channel. Y con nosotros el día de hoy nos acompaña John Heron. John es el General Manager para Trinnov Audio, pero ha estado en el mundo de audio por mucho tiempo. Incluso nos comentaba que fue el locutor de algunas radios, pero ha trabajado en compañías como Wisdom, Madrigal, y tiene ya bastantes años trabajando en Trinnov desde el 2016. Así que le damos la bienvenida. Realmente estamos muy contentos. Es otra de las marcas y otra de las sorpresas que teníamos en este Summit. Así que le damos la bienvenida a Trinnov, al portafolio de Polaris y a Latinoamérica, porque realmente es un segmento relativamente nuevo para ellos, a pesar de que, como lo vamos a ver en la presentación, Trinnov fabrica ciertos productos para algunas marcas reconocidas en la industria y pues que tal vez los van a familiarizar un poco más de esa manera. Así que thank you very much, John. We're really excited to launch Trinnov Audio on our 2021 Polaris Control Summit. We're also very, very happy to have this well-recognized worldwide leader brand in our portfolio and for our dealers in Latin America. So it's all up to you, John. Thank you very much for joining.
Okay, I will count on you because, okay, so I don't know how accomplished your entire audience is with English. I would encourage people, if I start speaking too quickly, to just send Ariel a note to tell me to slow down. That's fine.
Yes. Don't worry, we're doing this entirely in English. I'll be keeping up on the chat if anything comes up with the entire Polaris team. So go ahead.
Okay. So, assuming you can all see my screen at this point, this is just a quick agenda. I'm going to try to focus in the next 60 minutes or so just on a quick start. We can spend way more than an hour on this. But we're going to try and hit the highlights, give you what you need to know to just get started. And I encourage you to use the questions chat as we go along. I'll count on Ariel to monitor the questions and interrupt me as needed. So we'll run through this stuff pretty fast with an eye toward you being able to answer the question that is likely to come up. You know, Trinnov, who are they? All three of our founders got started back in about 2000. They were friends in a French engineering schools, and they're really as much scientists as they are engineers. All three have been passionate about audio and acoustics from the very beginning, and those are still the core drivers at Trinnov. We've grown a bit since 2000. We're almost 50 people now, spread across 6 time zones around the world. About half of all of our employees work in the R&D or research and development department, since we actually do real research. Excuse me, my phone was turned off, but it was ringing me anyway. We've published dozens of AES papers, and we do real science, not just product development. This gives us a different perspective and allows us to innovate rather than simply integrating technologies that other companies have invented. Okay, let's see here. Since the very beginning, we've had an interest in developing the science and the technology to capture, store, and subsequently recreate complex 3-dimensional sound fields. And that's actually reflected in our name, Trinnov Audio, notwithstanding the fact that it sounds Russian and is actually French. It comes from English words, which I'm told work well in other Romance languages. Trinnov Audio is derived from tri, as in 3, innovation in audio, so innovation in 3D sound. And that was from the beginning when the company was incorporated in 2003. That fellow on the right-hand side there, surrounded by a bunch of speakers, is Arno Laborie, working in one of the first labs. Arnaud and Remy and Sebastien plunged into a rather sophisticated analysis of, high order 3D sound research. They picked up where Michael Gerson of Ambisonics, some of your folks may recognize that name, they kind of picked up where he left off and took it further. That work led to the creation of the optimizer, because even their research array of 24 identical speakers didn't provide a seamless experience. Like all speakers, those 24 speakers suffered from small parts tolerances and so forth, but more importantly, their interactions with the room were wildly different due to the fact that they were in different parts of the room. So even that first generation of optimizer was created to solve several specific problems so as to ensure that the speakers were all working together rather than sometimes against each other. Our early commercial successes were in the pro business, among some of the most discerning and demanding customers on the planet. Jumping ahead a few years, the Altitude was introduced in late 2014. It was the first production surround processor to include Dolby Atmos for the home. From day one, it was able to decode and render up any of the 34 main channels plus LFE of Dolby Atmos for the home, up to a total of 32, which was the number of outputs the unit has. We had Atmos a couple of years before anybody else, and even now, 7 years later, we remain the only company that can render all of its available channels. Owners of Altitude 32 also received free upgrades to DTSX long before other companies had it, as well as full room-ready support for the music library and streaming platform that you may be familiar with. 2017 saw a new member of the Altitude family designed to bring the Altitude quality and performance to a somewhat more manageable price range. Even though it's somewhat less expandable, its HDMI board is designed to be easily upgraded, since that's always a moving target, and it runs the same software as the Altitude 32, so it benefits from all of the free software updates that we make available to our customers. At the same time as we were introducing a more affordable version of the Altitude, we were also raising the bar for what was possible. Adding an Altitude 48 extension, which is the box underneath the 32 in that photo, along with an optional software upgrade, allows the combination of the two boxes to decode and render up to 48 unique channels of audio, with a total of 64 channels available should you need some extra channels for active crossovers or elaborate bass management. And we'll cover all these products in more detail a bit later, but just trying to give you some perspective on the history. A little over a year ago, we introduced the Dtsx Pro with the ability to render all 30 main channels plus LFE of DTSX. A few other companies are just now beginning to deliver Dtsx Pro, but no one else can render all 30 of the channels that it supports. We remain the only ones who can do all of it. So hopefully you're getting an idea that something about the way the company is organized allows us to do stuff before anybody else. Another example of that is the Dolby Atmos Object Viewer. What it does is it actually illustrates how the mastering engineer used the Dolby audio objects that Atmos supports to create an immersive audio soundtrack. You can use it to help your clients understand what immersive audio is all about, and also to preview new potential demo material as it comes out to determine what might work for you best. We're the only company that allows you to see this information outside the dubbing stage where it was created, because only we have access to the native Dolby code for Atmos. Everybody else is using a chip. Just to give, I have struggled to get this to the point where you can hear both my voice through the microphone and the sound out of the presentation. So I don't think you're going to hear this. I'll just play a little bit of it so that you can sort of see the movement. But I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and type in Trinnov, and you'll see this and a bunch of others.
So John, para todos les dejé en el chat el link de este video que está presentando, así que si lo quieren revisar posterior a la conferencia, ya se los dejamos en el chat. So it's in the chat already, the link.
Oh, excellent. I was looking at the questions column, so I'll switch over to chat. Wonderful, thank you. Close that. So the little yellow balls are the audio objects, and in some mixes, they are relatively static, and that you can still get a really great immersive experience. But if you see a soundtrack that is designed to, that takes full advantage of what Dolby has provided the mixers in terms of tools, it not only looks pretty impressive, but it sounds amazing. It gives them a lot of creative freedom. Oh, okay, so I need to change the focus here. There we go. So we also, last year, it's actually started before then, but last year it became public knowledge that we had started a new partnership with Cypress Technologies, otherwise known as CYP. This work resulted in a new HDMI 2.0 board that uses the Panasonic chipset that everybody seems to like. But more importantly, it sets us up to have a properly implemented HDMI 2.1 board as soon as the silicon is ready to do that. It's not currently. So where am I here? There we go. So we remain active in 3 major markets. Our initial market, which was the pro world, recording studios, dubbing stages, post-production houses, broadcast monitoring facilities, things like that. We're also in the commercial cinema business, so actual movie theaters, and we're in the high-end residential business in both stereo and multi-channel. To my knowledge, we're the only company to be involved in that entire chain of content creation, commercial playback, and residential playback. It gives us some unique perspectives and capabilities. So moving on to what I hope is going to be a short review for most of you. Just run through the immersive audio formats to make sure that we're all using the terminology in the same way. Auro 3D is a channel-based system, just like stereo or 5.1 or 7.1. They simply have more channels available above the basic 7.1 layout that we're all pretty familiar with. And they're put there to create a more realistic reproduction of both musical events and movies. Wilfred, who's mentioned at the interview there at the end, is an accomplished concert pianist in addition to being the man behind Auro 3D. So it's not too surprising that the Auro Up mixer is considered by a lot of people, most people in fact, to be a game changer when it comes to reproducing music. Personally, I use it all the time when I'm listening to music. Trinnov, as I mentioned earlier, supported DTS's first Dtsx demo in 2015, and DTS actually developed Dtsx in part on the Altitude platform. It's explained actually in this video, which perhaps you can also link to our YouTube, the appropriate link at our YouTube. This partnership is partly responsible for Trinnov having the fully featured Dtsx Pro, while others have had to settle for the more limited chip-based version. Oops, I just saw that I heard someone talking, and it was that video that you can't hear. So let me move on. Rumors have it that at least one major streaming platform is going to start delivering content in the IMAX enhanced format sometime this summer. IMAX enhanced is actually a very specific version of DTSX. It's a 12.0 mix, so it's 12 channels, but they're all full range. There's no LFE. So, we got you covered in this regard, but if you're selling something at a lower price point, you want to be extra careful that it has really powerful and sophisticated bass management. Whether you're setting up a high-end home theater or a simple AVR-based system, if you're going to be doing IMAX enhanced, you need powerful bass management to save your speakers from getting blown up. Dolby Atmos, like DTSX, is a fully object-oriented format. In theory, it supports up to 64 objects at a time and can be rendered to as many as 34.1 channels. So in practice, the bandwidth limitations of Blu-ray and streaming services limit it to typically about 15 or 16 objects at once, but that's still enough for an incredibly engaging, immersive experience. As with DTSX, we support both all of the available channels and all of the available speaker layouts, so there aren't any limitations to your design of a state-of-the-art theater. You can do whatever the theater's size and scope requires. So we've been helping to design high channel count, high spatial resolution home theater since 2014. For the simple reason that we've been doing it longer than anybody else. We have more experience doing it than anybody else. We offer at places like CEDIA and ISE, we offer a 3-hour-long course on the subject of our speaker placement recommendations for a multi-listener, multi-format theater. And perhaps we can schedule a webinar on this subject, with the folks at Polaris. We certainly don't have time today, but a key takeaway from these design classes is this. You need to choose your speakers in terms of both number and placement based on the relationship between the entire listening area and the room itself. When you focus just on the main listening position instead of the entire listening area, it's really easy for some fairly important mistakes to be made. And again, we don't have time to get into that in depth, but we did write a book that was over 80 pages long on this subject, specifically to help our dealers and distributors better understand our thought processes and design recommendations. This book has been recognized as the authoritative guide on the subject by CEDIA themselves, and is the basis for the speaker placement recommendations found in CEDIA's recommended practices documentation that are still being finalized. I was in a meeting about 2 hours ago on this very subject with the CEDIA folks. Its basic recommendations are also incorporated into the CEDIA Designer software, or TCD, if you're familiar with that. So enough with history and technical overviews. Why should somebody buy a Trinnov instead of anything else? And to put it very simply, we can do a lot of things that nobody else can do. We'll take the next few minutes covering just some of the most important differences between what we can do and what other companies can do who are competing in our space. As I mentioned at the beginning, our founders were interested in doing basic research so as to expand the understanding of how complex three-dimensional sound fields really work. This required the development of a research platform that would allow them to experiment and to innovate. It had to be powerful enough to support advanced research and some really heavy calculations. It also had to be flexible enough not to become a limiting factor in what they decided to pursue. It also had to be easily updatable so they could try different ideas or avenues of investigation quickly and easily so as to keep pace with their own ideas and, frankly, award-winning research. That research platform in its current iteration is at the heart of pretty much everything we do. It has become, along with varying peripherals, the heart of almost every Trinnov audio product. One extra thing that I mentioned at the end of that slide, Trinnov is an implementer of advanced technologies like Atmos, Oro, and Dtsx, just like Analog Devices or Texas Instruments. Rather than waiting for those companies to decide how they will implement a watered down and cost-effective version of these powerful technologies, we can implement the technologies directly in their original form because we have this powerful platform. So we can run the native Dolby Atmos code or Dtsx Pro code, for example. Sustainable investment. Our CEO, Arnaud Labrie, recently made this statement for an article that we were writing that sums things up pretty nicely. I'll give you a moment to scan it. But between this really powerful platform that I described and some simple software updates and the modularity of the hardware platform, even the earliest altitudes from 2014 are still running strong. In fact, we still have serial number 1 in the R&D lab at the office, and not only is it running completely up-to-date software, it's actually running beta code that isn't even released yet at any given on any given day. It's usually being used by the R&D guys. So one of the core values at the company is about high spatial resolution, and this comes directly out of what the founders wanted to do research on way back in 2000. So by that I mean the recreation of a vividly realistic three-dimensional sound field in which you're just totally immersed. And there are a lot of things that go into achieving that goal, but 2 of them include higher resolution processing so that any errors that are made computationally are way below the threshold of audibility, and being able to use the original decoders for things like Atmos and Dtsx rather than the dumbed down versions available on inexpensive chips. So most of all, the high spatial resolution depends on being able to faithfully render the available object-oriented information to a whole lot of speakers, all working together. Higher channel counts are not only for big rooms. It's fairly obvious that in a big room, you'll probably need more speakers. But something that is less obvious, but just as true, is that whenever the listening area becomes a larger portion of the available space in the room itself, you also need to increase the speaker count for the benefit of the people sitting around the edges of that listening area. By doing that, you're anchoring the various sounds at specific places along the walls and even the ceiling. More speakers means that the location of the sound is less dependent on phantom imaging, like stereo, and more on actual speakers. But again, only if they can really work together rather than at cross purposes. Hence the optimizer. Arnaud's original lab had 24 identical speakers, 12 in a circle around him and another 12 in a circle above him. They also had a 24 capsule array of microphones, which was that spider nest looking thing that I showed early on. And they were doing extremely sophisticated spatial processing of the captured sound field information so as to translate from what the microphones captured to the much larger and very different array of loudspeakers. And it worked. They won a coveted science award for their work from the French Academy of Sciences. But they still weren't really satisfied. The speakers, as I mentioned earlier, had small but noticeable differences from one to the next because of parts tolerances, and they were placed in different parts of the same room, so they really were not working together as a completely seamless team, which led to the optimizer. It was born out of precisely that problem. How can we make sure that the speakers themselves are behaving more consistently and correctly? And what can we do to counteract the problems that the room itself introduces? So rather than simply trying to fix the power response or the total amount of energy in the room of the speakers in the room, they took a much more surgical approach that includes both amplitude and time domain corrections. So we're looking at things like frequency response, but also things like phase. And they decided to optimize each speaker's performance on its own, and then to look at all the ways in which the environment affects how the sound travels from the speaker to the listener. So there are several distinct problems to be solved along the way. And the idea was to solve each of those in the most effective, optimal way possible, and then to collect all of the solutions together into a single solution that, albeit complex, actually works. And along the way, based on their interest in high spatial resolution, the founders and additional team members created another proprietary technology on which we have a bunch of patents called remapping. In the real world, you frequently don't have the option of placing speakers precisely where you might like them to be. Things just get in the way. Windows, doors, lights, plumbing, structural framing. You often have to shift the speakers from where you want them to where they fit. And in terms of home theater, the three major formats that I mentioned earlier, Oro, Dtsx, and Dolby, can't even really agree on where you should put the speakers that are above and beyond the basic 7.1 that we've all, been living with for years and years. Remapping solves both of those problems quite nicely. Because we know where any given sound should be coming from since we're the ones decoding it. Unlike anybody else, we've built an extremely accurate three-dimensional map of where your speakers actually are using our unique microphone that you can see pictured there. And we can then use some complex calculations to use the 2 or 3 speakers that are closest to where the sound should be to create a phantom image of the sound actually coming from the right place. In effect, we can translate from the theory of the soundtrack to the reality of your particular theater. And this is, again, something that only Trinnov offers. Getting on to bass management, I mentioned that it was going to be important for IMAX Enhanced, but I think it's pretty much always important. One thing that you should probably know off the bat is, unlike most of the folks out there, we don't impose any limits on how many subwoofers you can have. If you wanted to do mono with 15 different subs using your brand new Altitude 16, you could do that. I think it'd be silly, but you could do it. We also provide a more comprehensive array of filter topologies and slopes than you've probably ever seen before. Our quick setup screen allows you to group similar speakers together and set their bass management all at once, rather than having to do every single speaker in a room that might have 25 speakers individually. So you can set all the screen channels, because they're probably going to be the same, then all the surround channels, probably going to be the same, and then all of the upper channels, and you're done. We even allow you to redirect bass from a bass limited speaker to the nearest speaker that's more capable in terms of bass, rather than only giving you the option to send it all the way to the subwoofer. That way, the more capable speaker can then be bass managed to the sub as kind of a second level of bass management at a frequency it makes sense for it. And this two-step approach prevents bass from, let's say, a flyover, for example. It prevents the bass from the flyover as being perceived as partly above you, but also coming from below you, the subwoofer. In this case, you could, for example, move, if you had to use small aperture speakers for the ceiling, you could send everything below 150 hertz for the left top front speaker to the left speaker, the screen channel, which presumably can go way below 150 hertz. But then, say below 50 or 60 hertz, you can send everything onto a sub. Finally, in terms of some of the special features that we offer you, our extranet allows your customers to register their products for their warranty, which is 5 years. Please encourage them to do so, since if it's not done, sometime soon after the sale, before they forget to do it, the only date we have is the manufacturing date of that particular serial number, and that might cause them to lose some of the warranty that they're entitled to receive. So, but once it's registered by the customer, another nice thing about our extranet is that it allows the folks at Polaris to access your customers' machines as though they were on a local area network with them. Polaris can provide software updates, install microphone calibration files, even do some fine tuning of your customer systems, all without having to leave the office, just the same way that we can do. And we are available for all of that stuff, especially for the first couple of systems that you install. We'd very much like to be involved so that we can help you through the process.
So before we move to product overview, I have a couple of questions coming up, even on my WhatsApp. So the first of them is, would you say that only really high-end projects can benefit from all this special characteristics that our Trinnov equipment and gear have?
I suppose it depends on where you draw the line for really high end. I mean, obviously our stuff is not,
but let's
we
say
don't make $400 AV receivers. So,
but let's talk about,
once you get to the point where you can afford, say, an altitude 16, even if it's a little bit of a stretch, the difference is dramatic compared to anything else that's out there at anywhere near the price.
So I'll try to rephrase the question, as it's probably what the dealer meant. Is it just for like dedicated theaters, or we can use it in multi-room applications? What can you say about that?
Well, it's not designed as a multi-room or multi-zone piece. There is a way in which it can be used a little bit. So let's say you have an altitude 32 and it has a full 32 channels, it's a fully loaded unit. If you're using 25 channels in a dedicated theater, then you have 7 channels left over. You could create either a stereo system or a modest theater or something in a different part of the house. You'd be able to run one or the other. The thing that you cannot do is to run different things in different zones, because the altitude was never designed as a multi-zone piece. But if you have extra, we do give you 29 presets, and a preset is just a snapshot of the current configuration of the machine. By creatively using those presets, it's very simple to say, I want you to use, these speakers over here in this room. Oh, now I want you to use those speakers over there in a different room.
So
now, as far as media rooms go and non-dedicated theaters, we're in those all the time. Those are actually some of the places where the differences between the optimizer and a lot of the alternatives are brought home the most dramatically. because, you know, if you have a dedicated home theater with really good acoustic treatment and all of that, there's frankly just less for the optimizer to fix than in a lot of multi-purpose, you know, family rooms or media spaces.
So that brings up to the next question, and I believe we're going to see it a little bit on the product overview. So people are asking about 2 hi-fi channel audio applications as well, not just multi-channel
Right.
applications.
That comes up pretty soon in the product interview, but to answer directly, we do have a couple of products that are very stereo focused, very music focused. One is a full-on preamp that is the control center for your whole system, and the other is more of an add-on to an existing system that gives you the active crossover and the optimizer. But we can jump right into that.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'll spare you the reading this list of bullet points because you can obviously digest this from going to the website or reading a piece of literature. But I will mention one or two things. Every other processor that I'm aware of, and I'm pretty plugged into what's out there, has to convert the incoming signal to a specific frequency, usually 48 kilohertz, before its internal DSP chip can do anything with it, because the DSP chip only runs at that one rate. So if let's say it's 48 kilohertz, which is by far the most common. If you're listening to just a normal CD, it has to be converted from 44.1 to 48, which is a fractional conversion, which is quite audible. It has a sound of its own. If you're listening to, 192 kilohertz and 24-bit high-end audio that you downloaded from, HD tracks or someplace like that on the internet, it is still on those other products converted down all the way to 48 kilohertz before it can do anything. Our software-based system with a much more powerful CPU can process the high sample rate information at its incoming rate. And we prefer to do our signal processing on the original data rather than a poorly made copy of the data. In the Altitude 32, we can handle everything at its incoming native rate up to 24-bit and 192 kilohertz, although there's a limit to how many of those channels we can process all at once. But if your customers have collected libraries of any of the high sample rate, 88.2, 96, 176, 174.6, that should be 176.4, sorry, or 192 kilohertz material, if they want to actually experience the full resolution of those recordings without first downsampling them to that lowest common denominator, they really don't have any other options. It's kind of us or nobody. Also, note that there's 16 on the Altitude 32. There are 16 channels of digital output, and normally these 16 are simply the digital version of half of the available 32 analog outputs. And that seems like it would be enough, but we occasionally take on some really ambitious theaters that go even further, so that's where we created the 48 extension. With it and some additional software, we can break that connection between the 32 analog channels and the 16 digital output channels. So then the 16 digital channels are sent on to this external box, which is much more than just a 32 channel balanced DDA converter. It's a full Trinnov processor in its own right. With it, we can render up to 48 unique channels, which normally this would be some combination of Atmos, Dtsx Pro, and Oro channels. And in addition, we can have up to a maximum of 64 processed channels in order to support active crossovers up to 4 ways, or sophisticated bass management, or both. As an example, if you take a look at this is an Altitude 32, an Altitude 48 extension, and 8 of our big power amps. We have actually installed, not many, but a handful of systems like this. And just to give you some idea, the Trinnov portion of this system, not including any speakers but just the electronics, is just about $200,000 US. That's at retail. But those big systems are pretty rare. The Altitude 16 hits a more affordable price point, and it does so not by reducing quality, but by reducing 3 things. We eliminated a lot of inputs and outputs that very few people ever used. We limited the number of outputs to 16 instead of going all the way to 32. And we reduced the size and the cost of the chassis a little bit So for example, we have a nicely painted faceplate rather than one that was laser engraved. It's a slightly smaller chassis, things like that, and it eventually adds up. The 16 will, for what it's worth, down convert 176.4 and 192 content by a factor of 2, so it comes down to either 88.2 or 96 respectively. By doing that, it avoids the fractional sample rate conversion that we don't like the sound of, and it still works on all the incoming signals at those higher rates at a higher frequency than any of our competitors do. It's very, if it's a compromise at all, it's a very small one. We also have some pretty terrific power amplifiers. One of the things that's quite different about them is that their gain has been precisely matched to the output capabilities of our preamps. So this carefully optimized gain structure yields an improvement of somewhere between 7 to 12 dB in signal to noise ratio compared to other amplifiers that you might select. That's a pretty big difference anytime, but especially if you're surrounding yourself with a lot of speakers, some of which are much closer than the usual, stereo speakers that are all the way across the room. The Amplitude 8, or Amp 8 as we call it, is really two big 4-channel power amps all in one chassis. You'll notice the 2 power cord inlets. It also has 2 on-off switches, 2 fuses. It has 2 big linear power supplies, big toroidal transformers and caps. And it weighs in at about 47 kilograms. So it's definitely a 2-man lift. The shipping weight is higher, but the net weight as you're pulling it out of the box is about 47 kilos. So it's a 2-man lift. Don't try and do it all by yourself. This amp has tremendous channel and power density, which is especially important in a high channel count system. I put it up against some much more expensive stereo amps, and it's won rather handily. We also have a somewhat less expensive 8-channel amplifier, the Amplitude 8M for mid-sized. Has almost the same power as the Amp 8 when it's given typical 8-ohm loads. And at a little over half the price, it's a tremendous bargain for systems that don't have especially challenging loads that the Amp 8 was really designed to handle. Like its big brother, this amplifier can use either 8 XLR connections or single DB25 cable to connect all 8 channels at once. Using the DB25 cable makes installing them in the rack and dressing the cables nicely so much easier. And it also eliminates any possibility of plugging in your wires in the wrong order. Note that a 20 amp power cord is required for this amp if you look closely in the little red box. This one may have a single power supply unlike the Amp 8, but it's a really big power supply. The amp, if we go back to the Amp 8, you can see it's got 2 plugs, but they're both 15 amp plugs. This is a single plug, but it's 20. Getting to stereo, the ST2 Hifi. It's for music systems that want all of our core technologies, but don't need a lot of other frills. So it includes a 2-way active crossover, so it can support either active or passive 2.0 systems, or that same crossover can be used to add subwoofers to a stereo system for either a 2.1 or 2.2 system. You can think of this box as a pure speaker room optimizer for a stereo system. There are thousands of the Pro version of this box in use at recording studios all around the world. The Pro version of this box is our biggest selling single product. The Amethyst is a superset of the ST2 Hifi. It has everything the ST2 Hifi has, plus a few other things. So I tend to describe it as 5 different components in one box. It's a preamp with 12 different analog and digital inputs. It's a fully balanced D-Day converter. It includes the same 2-way active crossover found in the ST2 Hifi. It has 2 different music streaming capabilities, both UPnP DLNA and also it's room ready. It's a room ready endpoint. And of course, it includes our speaker and room optimizer. So, and like the Altitude 32, it can natively process PCM signals up to 192 kilohertz. So with that, we get to a couple of the videos that unfortunately, because of the nature of GoToWebinar, I won't be able to play for you in terms of sound, but I think Ariel has the links ready.
Hey John,
or can
we
be
have
posted.
a couple of questions that
Sure.
I think we should get to before you play the videos. Let me see. Would you say that? Oh no, we already did this. Is a thorough training required to become a dealer?
No, we do.
How much of a thorough training?
So there is a setup wizard, and I believe, I forget if it's on the YouTube channel. I'll have to check. But there is a setup wizard, and if you can, follow fairly simple instructions, complete with pretty pictures. My wife taught a bunch of 9-year-olds for 18 years, and I think any 9-year-old could probably do this. At the end of the setup wizard, you're at about a 90% level. That last 10% comes from actually listening and kind of fine tuning and tweaking. But the setup wizard will get you completely configured and calibrated and ready to go, completely functional. The last little bit is fine tuning to get that last little bit of performance out of it. Now, we do provide a lot of one-on-one support. So particularly for the first couple of installations, I'd encourage you to be in contact with either Polaris or us. Chuck Back and I do this. Chuck Back is my, a colleague here in the U.S. He's in California, so he's on West Coast Pacific time. I'm on the East Coast. But between the two of us, we do a lot of one-on-one support, particularly for the first couple of units that you calibrate. The surround processor as a category is probably the most complicated thing that you sell at this point. And they're all, different enough that learning a new one is always, a little bit of a challenge.
So before the Trinnov webinar, we were just finishing up a webinar with Paul from Pro Audio Technologies. So a couple of dealers have already asked me, how do you see an application working with Pro Audio Technologies on the speaker selection?
Oh, we do it all the time. Paul has an Altitude 32 in his entertainment center. Paul's personal preference, which I understand, it strikes me as a little bit more work than is really necessary, but I respect it. Paul's preference is because he also sells amplifiers, and the amplifiers have a lot of DSP in them. And of course, he's just completely familiar with those because he designed them, right? So his preference is to go through and dial in the system using the DSP in his amplifiers. But even after you do that, the DSP in his amplifiers don't do any of the time domain correction that we can do. So one of the things you can do that's very easy and to get the sort of the best of both worlds. One of the settings in the optimizer is to optimize according to left and right speakers. So let's assume that Paul spends a bunch of time and gets the system just exactly the way he likes it. I know from experience that he puts a lot more time in on the screen channels because that's the most important thing. Well, there's a setting in the optimizer that's when you choose this according to left and right, what it does is it measures the left speaker and it measures the right speaker, and then inevitably there are going to be small differences, but some differences between left and right, if only because of slight asymmetries in the room or whatever. So what we do is we take the average of left and right, we force both the left and right to meet that average perfectly, so just stereo imaging gets better and tighter and more focused.
Yeah.
But then we use that as the target curve for every other speaker in the system. So, to the degree that any other speaker in the system can match what the front speakers are doing, that's what we do. Now, obviously, we respect the low frequency cutoff and also the high frequency cutoff. If a speaker can really only get down to, say, 50 or 60 hertz instead of down to 20, because the speakers behind the screen are really big and there are smaller ones for surrounds and smaller still up in the ceiling, we respect those limitations, but within the range of what the speaker can do, we'll do our best to make it match everything else, well, the left and the right in this case.
So people are also asking, what's your best seller on the Altitude line? And also, what do you see? It's kind of an average of channels used typically in the CI channel?
Boy, I think it's almost a little bit misleading to say an average because there's such a wide range.
Yeah.
We're involved in systems that are, 5.1 all the way up to, 30 and 40 channels and more. Our biggest seller in terms of unit volume, so the Altitude 32 comes in multiple configurations. You can buy an Altitude 32 with 8, 16, 24, or 32 channels, depending on, what you need to do. If somewhere down the road, let's say you start with a 16 channel version of the 32 and you decide, I should have bought a 24 channel version. The upgrade from the 16 to 24 is just the difference in retail price between them. So there's no penalty for doing it in stages if that's what your customer ends up doing. Having said that, if you lump all of the variations of the 32 together, the number of those that we sell is from month to month almost always within 10% of the number of 16s that we sell. So if you look at any one of those 4 flavors of the Altitude 32, certainly the 16 outsells it. But if you take the 32 kind of as a family of products, it's pretty even. It really, and when people ask me which one they should buy, I really, it comes down to look at the connectors on the back of the units, and if there are some specific connectors on the 32 that aren't on the 16, well, there's your answer. If you need those connectors. So, for example, we have the 16 channel digital output, so it's 8 AES-CBU balanced digital pairs. And if you have an existing Meridian customer, they have a 271 box that will convert those 16 digital channels to their proprietary speaker net or speaker link, I forget what it's called, system. And so a lot of our 32 sales, especially the 16 channel version of it, are actually to replace things like the Meridian 861 when people decide they want 3D audio.
So now that you're talking about other manufacturers, can you tell us a little bit about more how you interact with other third-party vendors in helping them, like JBL Synthesis, and in the past you've done with other ones?
So JBL is a little bit of a special case. They approached us back in 2015, before I was actually with the company, and they wanted their own branded version of an Altitude 32, and we have been approached by quite a few companies with similar, requests. The difference with Harman was that if your audience is familiar with the Syn 1, Syn 2, Syn 3, they've always gone to market as a package deal, where you buy a certain collection of stuff, but it's a single decision. It's not buying a processor and an amplifier and a bunch of speakers. It's all, how big a room do you have? Good, this is what you need. Because of that closed ecosystem, we could either choose to be part of it or not. And we chose, well, that's obviously plus business, because if we're not there, they'll just sell something else. By comparison with most other companies that have approached, well, all of the companies that have approached us, that was business that we were already getting. If you think of a speaker manufacturer, the way it works with the SDP75, which is the Harman version of an Altitude 32, if it's a Harman-based system with JBL speakers and so on, then it should be the SDP75. And if it's anything other than either those JBL synthesis speakers or certain Revel speakers, any other speaker on the planet, it should be on Altitude. And there are actually some differences between the products that support that approach.
Do you also have something to do with the SDR35, or it's just the SDP75?
Only the 75.
Okay.
The SDP, well, the smaller numbers, they've never actually introduced it, but the SDP 65 was supposed to be their version of an Altitude 16, and for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with the various certifications that are needed to sell around the world. So it's Underwriters Laboratory and CE and CSA, and the list just goes on and on. Harman has not gotten around to launching the STP65 yet. So it's only the 75. That's like our 32. Everything else comes from other sources like RCAM or whatever.
So I believe that's pretty much what we have on the questions and chat panel. Anything else, John, before we finish and wrap up? I have already, for all the folks here on the webinar, if you go to the chat window, you'll see a lot of links to information on the Trinnov YouTube channel. So please feel free after the webinar to go by those. And it's really interesting, and you'll get a little bit more of a grasp of what you can do and who Trinnov is. So anything else to add before we close out, John?
Yeah, well, I can't read your links well enough to know which ones they're pointing to, but I would encourage everybody to take a look at this Portuguese installation just because it's fun. The customer is a huge fan of James Bond, and he also collects Aston Martins for a hobby, which says something about his net worth, I think. But this is a somewhat extreme case, but in this video, which is maybe 5 minutes long, Contexto, which is the integrator, mentions that, you know, the reason they chose the Altitude 32, and he goes into it, and he's like, there are only 2 surround processors in the world that can do that, and the other one is a closed system. You have to buy their processor and their amplifiers and their speakers, and the other one he was speaking of was the STP75, because that's the way that Harman sells it. But in effect, he was saying, you know, the Altitude 32 can do this, and it's the only one on the planet that can do it, unless you count the version of it that has a different faceplate. So there's that. I think you had mentioned let me continue. I didn't mean to start running that.
No, don't worry.
There we go.
So we have our last question from Harry Reynolds in Puerto Rico. It says, is there an app for streaming on the Amethyst if not using Roon?
Yeah, Bubble UPnP works quite well. In theory, any UPnP DLNA app will work. In practice, like pretty much all things Microsoft, UPnP DLNA is less bulletproof than you would like it to be. In our experience, the Bubble server and Bubble UPnP work really well, and there are a few others. We haven't tested everything. In my experience, Roon just has such the user experience is so much nicer that I'm biased. I prefer Roon, but anything. I mean, JRiver works with UPnP DLNA. I don't know, exactly what.
Okay. So thanks very much for that, Harry. Thank you for the question. So John, we need to close out now. We're pretty excited about it. Thank you very much. I believe this is going to be our first from many sessions with all of our LATAM dealers. So we really appreciate taking time for this.
Okay.
Amigos, estamos entonces por comenzar el próximo webinar. Para terminar, continuamos con la parte de pantallas de proyección dedicadas para teatros en casa. Así que los esperamos en este webinar de Screen Innovations. Así que por favor continúen con el siguiente link en la agenda. Si no lo tienen, contáctense con alguien de Polaris para podérselo proporcionar. Y por favor, estén atentos a cualquier información relacionada también con esta excelente nueva marca de Trinnov. Muchísimas gracias y los veo en el otro link. Thanks, Sharon.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.